real gem for us here in Perkasie. And we'd like to welcome Scott back for his presentation on early Perkasie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks for having me back. And basically, I got involved with early Perkasie history because, as the president of Perkasie Park, we're trying to get on the National Register of Historic Places. And I spent about a year and a half researching the history, not of the park, but also like early Perkasie. And then the park, like the Historical Society, Borough Council, were very frugal with our money. So I wound up writing a lot of the actual proposal for the register. And I probably used about 10% of my research actually for that whole process. But I had a lot of information about early Perkasie that I'd like to share with you guys tonight. And Perkasie really, you think of Perkasie was incorporated as a borough in 1879. There's a long history in this region before 1879. And a lot of it had to do with the Stout family, some of the other Pennsylvania German families like the Strasburgers, the Hartzels, the Grofs, who were here really in the colonial era. So we're going to do a little brief slideshow presentation here on PowerPoint. And I have some maps I found on the internet which are pretty interesting. And you'll notice on this first map thing here, this is a train map from 1865. There's no Perkasie train station, but there's something called the tunnel siding. And that is where the train stopped in 1865 to drop stuff off in Perkasie. But at that point, there wasn't really a village of Perkasie.
I see that, Scott, excuse
Yes.
me for interrupting that. Sellersville said Sellersburg.
Yes, they weren't big on grammar back then, or being correct. And Sellersville was actually before 1865, but it's an interesting map. So our first topic tonight is who was the first resident of Perkasie. In 1895, there's a story in the Central News, which we all know is very reliable and accurate back then. And they speculated about the first resident of Perkasie. They were doing a dig in town for a cellar at a David Bean's house, which was at 5th and Chestnut, and they found some bones. So they postulated that the first resident was a mastodon. And the reason they thought it was a mastodon is they measured the teeth were 4 inches long, they weighed 4 ounces. They assembled the jaw, they took it into Neiman's drugstore and put it on display. But when you do modern fact-checking, a mammoth tooth is like 2 to 3 pounds normally. So it probably was not a mammoth, it was some kind of a horse or something that was there. But they were kind of convinced it was the Perkasie mammoth. And this is really, it's interesting analogy because when you do research historically into storytelling, some things seem true, some things seem like an exaggeration. And the Mastadon story is an exaggeration. Really, back then they thought it was likely true, but it kind of got exaggerated over time. But there probably was not a mastodon, at least that mastodon was not in Perkasie. Now, Perkasie Borough was formed in 1879, and basically it has an interesting history before then. The name Perkasie goes back to the era of William Penn, and basically South Perkasie has its own separate identity from Perkasie. 1898, South Perkasie, or what was called Benjamin then, was annexed to Perkasie. But really, there's a lot of interesting history about Perkasie before that period. The key event in the history of Perkasie at that time period was the construction of the Landis Ridge train tunnel, which really led to the creation of the borough. William Penn came over here in 1862. His father was an admiral in the British Navy. He was owed a lot of money by the government. The government gave him the land in Pennsylvania in exchange for the debt. And when he came over here, he had sent advanced scouts, and his people came over to check out the situation in Pennsylvania. And it wasn't a good situation because there's some Swedes that came over here before the Quakers. The Swedes offended the Indians, the Lenni Lenape. They wound up killing a bunch of the Swedes. So when Penn came over, he did what we call outreach today to really kind of befriend the Indians so he could buy their land, which was fine with the Lenni Lenape because basically they didn't really think they owned the land anyway, so they were more than happy to sell him the property. The Lenni Lenape were a kind of a subservient Indian nation. There were two Indian nations, or really were the big Indian nations back then, were the Iroquois and the Susquehannock, and they were constantly fighting, and the Lenape were kind of like subservient to those two nations. And the Susquehannock at one point were upset with the Lenape, and they did a horrible thing. They made them all move to New Jersey. So when the Iroquois defeated the Susquehannock, they let them come back to our area, but they really didn't have an attachment to this area, so they had no problem selling the land to Penn. Now, when we go to the next slide, this is the very famous painting from Benjamin West. It basically shows the meeting at Shackamaxon in Philadelphia between Penn, the Quakers, and the Indians with Chief Tamanend. Now, Chief Tamanend is kind of a legendary figure. He was a sachem or a chief in a village. Every Lenni Lenape village had 3 chiefs. Basically, he was the head of a family or a clan called the Turtle Clan, and the Turtle Clan was always the chief in the village. So at Shackamaxon, we think they had this big meeting, which was documented by people like Benjamin West and other people, where they agreed that they would sell land to the Quakers. But the first land sale was not at Shackamaxon. The first land sale basically took place in what was called the Indian village of Perkasie. And at some point, William Penn and his party took off on the Old Bethlehem Pike, or Old Bethlehem Road. They came out to this area, they sat down with Tamanend, and they agreed to buy all the land north of the Neshaminy that could be walked in 2 days. And it's interesting because we really don't know where this meeting happened, because there weren't maps of the meeting, there wasn't like a newspaper back then that recorded it. There's a story where it may have happened in Chalfont, and Chalfont takes credit for having Tamanend. Silverdale takes credit for having Tamanend. Hilltown takes credit for having Tamanend. We really don't know where he lived, and one of the theories is the Lenni Lenape always lived on the Neshaminy, and they would live at a confluence of 2 rivers. But when you get into the word origin of Perkasie and the etymology of Perkasie, there's kind of a doubt on whether he lived on the Neshaminy. He may have lived on the Perkiomen. And basically there are 3 sources for this. One source is from a missionary called the Reverend Jesse Volger in the 1830s. It was in Missouri, and he lived with the Lenni Lenape out there. And his interpretation of the word Perkasie was the place where hickory nuts are cracked. Now, we usually see that like in literature about Perkasie, but there's a missionary before him, the Reverend Heckwelder, who was born in 1749. He became a missionary in 1769. He lived with the Lenape when they were here and moved to Ohio in the Midwest. And he said the word meant the place abundant with mice. But before that, there's a very famous historian named John Oxmixon who did the first history of North America, and his interpretation of the word Perkasie was Perkiomen. So possibly when Penn came out to meet with Tamanend, he was going out to the Perkiomen and not the Neshaminy, which means he could have been here, he could have been over in Telford. I mean, there are different places he could have been. But it's interesting because we have a language, we have 3 different interpretations on the same word, and no one quite agrees on what it is. Now, this is a map of the Perkasie region in 1730. And it's interesting because if you go to the upper right-hand corner and look where the crown is and where there's space, that's where Perkasie is. That is Hilltown and Rock Hill Township in 1730. And the reason it's empty is because the Penn family didn't sell land until 1730 in the matter of Perkasie. Now, basically, at that point in time, the Pennsylvania Germans are starting to arrive in the Perkasie area. A lot of them migrated from an area called the Palatinate in southern Germany. In 1730, Perkasie Manor was opened for settlement to Europeans. It was all pretty much either Mennonites, Pennsylvania Germans. And the first real families that started to show up in this area were the Hartzels, the Stouts, and the Groffs. And at that point, the Lenni Lenape had started to leave the area and really go to western Pennsylvania and Ohio. Now, this is a map I found online. This is the actual survey plot from 1730 for the manor of Perkasie. And the area in blue in the bottom was owned by James Logan, who was the personal secretary to the Penn family. As you can see where County Line Road is in 1730. And basically, this is kind of like Line Lexington. You can see on the top, Rock Hill Township with the rocks. There's 3 Mile Run, east branch of the Perkiomen, and then the Neshaminy. And this is really before the land was settled. And there's a reason why we know a lot about the Stout family. Basically, there was a guy in the turn of the last century named Ralph Beaver Strasburger. He was very, very rich. His father was a top lawyer in Philadelphia. He inherited the family fortune. He built Normandy Farms because it was a replica of his farm in Normandy. And he was very, very wealthy. And in addition to that, he married the heiress to the Singer sewing machine fortune, when Singer had a patent on sewing machines. And he was obsessed with the Stouts and the other families. The Perkasie, because his great-grandfather was a reverend up here. So he hired genealogists. They wrote a 900-page family history in 1922, which talks a lot about the Stouts and these Strasburgers. Now, Jacob Stout was the original Stout who came over here. He came over here in 1737 from southern Germany. He married the widow Anna Lacey. Her husband had bought the piece of property, which is really current downtown Perkasie. In 1737, he had passed away also. And they got married in 1739. And he lived on the homestead until 1779 when he passed away. He was a very famous potter. He came over here with money. The family had money. They were middle-class Germans. He bought property, but it was a good area to do pottery. He did very well financially. Now, the picture up here is a piece of his pottery that's in the Philadelphia Art Museum in Philadelphia. And I guess the next event is about redware,
Yes.
where I guess you'll learn a lot more about his techniques. This is a plate he did with his stepson, John Lacey, in 1761. Now, here is a picture of one of the three deeds we were talking about. When Jacob Stout married Anna Miller Lacey, she could not own property as the heir because she was a woman. So the stepsons had the rights to the property, but they could not buy the property or assume it until they were of age. So what Jacob Stout did is he bought two farms. He basically traded the two farms to the two kids for the property, which is current downtown Perkasie. And this is one of the deeds from that land transaction that the Historical Society now owns. It's the deed from Jacob Stout to his stepson, John Lacey, for a farm in Hilltown that he traded for the farm in Perkasie. Now, Jacob's oldest son, Abraham Stout, is probably the most famous of the Stouts, and he's one of the Stouts buried in the Stout Cemetery. His father obviously was connected and had money. He paid for him to go to Germantown Academy. He was one of the first students at Germantown Academy. He was highly educated. He was bilingual. He spoke and wrote German and English. He could work as a surveyor. He was a penman for deeds. He was an accountant. So he handled a lot of the financial transactions for Upper Bucks County. Now, this little newspaper article I have here shows that he had money because he actually paid for an indentured servant. And here he's looking in 1772 for someone to return his servant who escaped from Rock Hill Township. And another famous story about the Stouts is the presence of the Redcoats in modern-day Perkasie. And there's 4 or 5 different sources for this. There was a guy named Dr. Zeno Stout Kyle, who was the town veterinarian in Perkasie in the late 1890s. He was kind of the town historian, and he recounted this in great detail. There's other sources for it, where the Redcoats came out here the same winter that Washington was at Valley Forge. The rebels are manufacturing gunpowder up in Zionsville, which we know as Powder Valley. That's why it's called Powder Valley. And they were actually running gunpowder either through Ridge Road. And what they did is they camped out in his barn, and they used that for his scouting parties. And I think it's a true story. I've read it 4 or 5 times from different sources. I mean, there wasn't a newspaper back then that reported it. The key thing is they stayed in the barn. Someone had made a story up, they would have said the house, but the British were very sensitive to how they possessed property during the conflict because they saw themselves as winning the war and just kicking out the rebels. So they would have definitely stayed in the barn if they were up here. And he was a really significant historical figure for various reasons. This is a map of 1770 of Bucks County. And it's interesting for several reasons. Basically, it shows that there's not one, there's 2 Bethlehem roads or 2 Bethlehem pikes. Now, what a lot of people don't realize, and the Lehigh Valley Historical Society got into this in the 1920s, is the original Bethlehem road is not our Bethlehem pike, it's Hilltown Pike. And they took Hilltown Pike up to Mincy Trail Road, and they went up to through Knockemixon would be now to Bethlehem. And a couple of years later, they built the Bethlehem Pike. The Bethlehem Pike was a toll road. The old Bethlehem Road was a road that was not a toll road. But you can also see in there, there's very little settlement going on in 1770. But between where the two red arrows are is approximately where Perkasie and Sellersville would be. Now this is a picture from the Stout Bible, which we'll, I guess, see in May, hopefully here. The Stout Bible is significant is because it was given to Abraham Stout Margaretta roughly in 1778, 1779. It was printed in 1776 by a very famous printer called Christoph Sauer. And I think Van Journ will get into this a lot, but basically, I think it was the third Bible printed in America, because the English had a patent on English language Bibles. They would not allow them to be printed here. So the Bibles were German. And the book's in great shape. Hopefully we can all get to see it when it's here. And it's really a special kind of, artifact for us. Aside from the deed and a couple of deeds in the museum in Doylestown, I don't know if we have anything this old that really belongs to Perkasie. Now, Abraham Stout was a significant figure for several reasons. I mean, he did a lot of business for the Pennsylvania Germans. He was a government official for Bucks County. He was on the safety committee in 1774 that made the first decision about whether they were going to fight in the Revolution. He did not go to the second committee meeting because his parents were Mennonites, and as a Mennonite, he could not take an oath to go to war. But later in 1787, after the Constitution was ratified in Philadelphia, he was a member of the delegation for Pennsylvania when the state ratified it. So if you look at the actual list here in the article of the people who were voted into the convention, you can notice the old-fashioned S. It's Benjamin Rush, who's a very famous figure. James Wilson, a key constitutional figure. They ran Ben Franklin, kind of a straw candidate, knowing he couldn't get in because he was too sick to serve. David Rittenhouse. But in the bottom of the list, there's 4 people representing Bucks County, and Abraham Stout represented all of Upper Bucks County at the convention to ratify the Constitution in Philadelphia. So basically, the Stouts were very significant. A second real significant family in early Perkasie were the Strasburgers. Now, a lot of you head out of town towards Silverdale, you'll see that old big house on the left-hand side that's kind of up on the side of the road. That's the Strasburger house. And that was basically was Reverend Andrew Strasburger. He was a very significant figure in the community. Another family that was big in South Perkasie were the Groffs. The Groffs had property there since really the 1760s. And they owned a lot of South Perkasie, but also, I guess, eventually what became Sellersville. Now here's an only picture I know of the Reverend Strasburger. And basically, his father had money. He was in the tanning business, he owned a tannery in Northampton County where there were a lot of birch trees. And he expected his son to inherit the business. And his son said, "No, I want to be a preacher." So he said, "That's good, but I'm not going to financially support you." So basically, he went to Philadelphia. He was in the Reformed Church. He studied in Philadelphia, and at the age of 22, he became the pastor of Indian Creek, Tohickon, Reformed, the church in Sellersville, and what was called Charleston, which we now call Trumbowersville. And he reconciled with his father before his father died. He inherited a lot of money, and he bought a lot of land around here. So basically, he started the mill, which is now the Benfield Mill. He's responsible probably for the bridge in South Perkasie. He owned a lot of farmland, but he had these 4 different jobs that he did as a preacher. So in his lifetime, he did 3,000 baptisms and 1,000 burials before he retired. And his wife was Abraham Stout's granddaughter. Now, this is a map from 1850, that's interesting because it's really the first map that shows houses located in Perkasie. So you'll see where the red and blue lines are, right above that. This line here is Branch Road, or Main Street in South Perkasie. You can see where the call is for the arrow where the Strasburger house is. You can see kind of where that rectangle is, right at the Stout Homestead. That would be the current location of Perkasie above the east branch of the Perkiomen. And this is interesting for us because at some point we'll be able to use this to track down if some of these old houses still exist, because we have enough detail on the map. There's a close-up of the map, and where I have the call out there is Lessig Schoolhouse. And you can see where it kind of mirrors like Park Avenue where it comes into Perkasie. And there's just not a lot in town. There are two properties owned by the Naces. One of them is probably the Stout Homestead. But you can really get a better look at South Perkasie to see where the different houses were located. There's no perk yet. The perk is not built. The second mill is not built. And this is in 1850. Now, the big event in the area was the construction of the Landis Ridge Tunnel. Now, the North Pennsylvania Railroad started this in 1853. In 1857, they sent the first train from Bethlehem through the tunnel to officially open it. But the problem they had is they were massively over budget. The original estimate was $50,000 to build the train system from, I guess, Gwinnett Valley to Bethlehem. It cost them $50,000 per mile to build it. And it was a public company, so it's all over the newspapers. They're always arguing about stuff. And right before the tunnel opened here, there was the largest train accident in U.S. history. There was a train full of school children that left in June of 1856 from Fort Washington. They lost track of which trains were on which tracks. There was a head-on collision. 66 people died in the crash, and it was like a national disaster. So really, between those two things, the railroad got off to a really weak start. But at this point, once the train tunnel is opened, more business comes into South Perkasie because they can basically, either using the bridge or other roads, they can access the train line in Sellersville or the one switch that's in what was called Conleyville at that point. Now here's a picture of the first church ever built in the town of Perkasie. It's the original Evangelical Church in Bridgetown, which is now part of the graveyard that's close to my house in South Perkasie. But the Perk was built right after this. They added the second mill. St. Andrew's Church was opened in 1867 by the guy who owned what was the Perk then. And South Perkasie really has its own identity as a town with a lot of buildings. And the person who really got Perkasie Borough established was a man named Joseph Hendricks. He was a store owner in Sellersville. He saw the potential of the train tunnel area. There was a gentleman named Samuel Hager who first came into Perkasie in the late 1850s. He built the building which is now the Treasure Trove, which is the only building standing that he built. He actually had built 4 buildings there. And he went bankrupt in 1862. Hendricks came in, he bought up the land really in the late 1860s with his clerk, Mahlon Myers, who was on a bunch of the deeds. And he inherited the property that was left by Hager, but he had a problem. The problem was when Hager named the town or the village after President Conley of the railroad, he greatly angered President Conley because he didn't like brown nosers or something. So basically, he would not stop the train in Perkasie. They would only stop to unload late freight. Occasionally, there was a switch, and basically, no one was really using the train track there. So in latter years, there was a guy who was a bricklayer who came into town who built a lot of the original houses in Perkasie. His name is Andrew Groman. He talked in the newspaper because he was friends with who he called the boys, Hendricks, and the Moyer brothers, and a guy named Tillman Adjeny. And he said what they did is they sent this guy a gigantic gift basket in Christmas in 1870, full of turkeys and rabbits and fruit and stuff like that. And the guy had an epiphany. He changed his mind, and he said, there will be a train station called Perkasie next to the tunnel. So that was really the thing that kicked off the town of Perkasie in 1872. There's the first story about Perkasie in the Intelligencer in Doylestown that talks about the train station, the hotel, which was Perkasie Hotel or Horace Hotel at the time. More houses start to be built. Perkasie Park is used as a public facility. And over the next 7 years, because they were doing 3 to 5 train stops a day, the town really took off and it really took advantage of its location next to the tunnel. So in 1879, Perkasie Borough was formed, which really kind of formalized the area and really led to a tremendous amount of growth. In 1898, the residents of Benjamin had changed their name, Bridgetown had changed their name to Benjamin. and they decided they had to join Perkasie Borough because they needed the electric utilities that were going into town. So that's basically the basic things I've learned through my research about the early history of Perkasie. I'm not a native Perkasian, I'm from Lansdale. My mother's family is from Perkasie. I love the town, I love being here, I love the history, and to me it's fascinating. And to me the real big thing is this newspaper project, once we really get that thing going, because there's so much information in these newspapers. There's so much. Mr. Moyer, who was one of the town founders, was the co-owner with Mr. Kramer, who owned Menlo Park. And they knew everybody's business in town. It was always in the newspaper. So hopefully a year from now I can come back, we'll have these things digitized. Maybe we can talk about Perkasie in the Victorian era, really in its heyday. So does anybody have any questions? Yes?
Can you talk about the first strike in Perkasie in 1865?
In Perkasie?
Yes.
No, I don't know about it.
It was a labor strike. They were building a tunnel.
Oh, yes, yes, yep.
And the stonemasons went on strike. They wanted
It
25...
was 1885.
1885.
Yes, that was part of the National Railway strike.
Yeah, and they wanted 25 cents more a day. They were getting paid $1.75.
Right.
$2 a day. And they went out and the tunnel got finished.
Yeah, that's in that book that James Moyer did, where he sat down for years and actually transcribed a lot of the papers. And that's in there. That's a very famous national story about the train strike. And there's a lot of we could do a whole thing just on the train system and how they built that tunnel and how they tried to double track the tunnel and do all kinds of interesting stuff. And who died in the tunnel. I mean, there's all kinds of stories about that. Yes?
When did the trolleys first come to Perkasie?
Quakertown traction line and the inland traction line were the two trolleys. They were tied into the availability of electric in town. So in 1900s, when they first started to run, they started planning in 1898. And I know that was at Perkasie Park, and our records, there were a lot of negotiations about the trolley, and we were negotiating over easements and land rights and stuff like that.
And the tunnel was built in 1910
Yes,
for the trolley.
yes, 1910, 1911 maybe?
It started in 10 and it took
Yeah.
a little while.
Yeah, they had a problem with the trolley because they originally ran down the left-hand side of Perkasie Park and it made a 90-degree angle, and it kept, tipping over. And because they were coming downhill, and trolleys actually ran really fast when they had space to pick up steam. So they basically rerouted the trolley through the park into a different trolley route. Okay, well, thanks, and hopefully I can come back in a year, maybe talk about the newspapers, and we get that project kicked off. And thanks again for coming out in this weather. We appreciate it.
Thank you.